This peculiar episode in European history has left us with more than just a cadre of profoundly unsettled archaeologists. To begin with, it has entirely transformed our approach to ancient artifacts. Nowadays, museums enforce stringent regulations regarding the handling of human remains, and indeed, consuming them is strictly prohibited. Certainly on that list. The entire episode of Consuming Mummies serves as an exemplary illustration of the consequences that arise when we regard ancient cultures merely as curiosities rather than as genuine civilizations. It also highlights how easily widely accepted knowledge can be fundamentally incorrect. For centuries, the most brilliant minds in Europe endorsed mummy medicine. The next time someone asserts that everyone is aware of something, recall that there was a time when it was commonly believed that consuming mummies was beneficial for one's health. It is simple to reflect on the past and think, wow, those individuals were irrational. However, it is important to remember that they were not monsters. They were simply individuals attempting to address issues with the understanding they possessed. Admittedly, that understanding was entirely erroneous. Yet they sincerely believed that mummy medicine could save lives, sometimes literally wagering their lives on it. The true lesson here is not merely to refrain from consuming mummies, though seriously, do not eat mummies. It is about recognizing that even the most intelligent individuals can hold some rather outlandish beliefs when those beliefs become intertwined with tradition and authority. The next time you find yourself unwell and reach for the latest trendy supplement circulating on social media, perhaps take a moment to consider those Europeans and their mummy medicine. After all, at least your so-called miracle cure is not derived from ancient human remains. The first crack in the reputation of mummy medicine came from an unexpected source: the tomb raiders themselves. By the 1700s, they began to confess that many of the ancient Egyptian mummies they had were actually fabricated. Nothing undermines a luxury market quite like discovering that one has been consuming recently deceased criminals instead of ancient pharaohs. Then came the era of scientific reasoning. Doctors began to engage in unprecedented practices, such as actually testing the efficacy of medicines. Revolutionary, right? They started to question traditional remedies. And as it turns out, there was little evidence to support the notion that consuming ground-up mummies cured anything, except perhaps an increased appetite. However, the definitive blow to the trend of mummy consumption came from a rising interest in authentic Egyptian culture, Egyptian history. As scholars began to study hieroglyphs and delve into ancient Egyptian culture, they stumbled upon a startling revelation. These mummies were individuals, real people with names, narratives, and beliefs regarding the afterlife. European perspectives underwent a significant transformation. The same social circles that once indulged in mummy-tasting parties now deemed it barbaric. Museums began to collect and conserve mummies rather than pulverizing them. By the late 1800s, the practice of consuming mummies had transitioned from a prestigious medical remedy to something that people feigned ignorance about having participated in. The unfortunate reality is that by the time Europe developed this moral awareness, countless mummies had already been obliterated. We are referring to a substantial segment of human history that was ground up and ingested due to a prolonged medical trend. Some estimates indicate that Europeans processed hundreds of thousands of mummies during this era. Others would arrange mummy unwrapping ceremonies, transforming the desecration of ancient remains into a trendy social event. The truly astonishing aspect is that these activities were not regarded as shocking or taboo during that era. European nobility perceived mummies as exotic commodities rather than human remains. They would casually converse about the optimal methods for preparing mummy meat as if they were exchanging culinary advice. Some hosts would even boast about the vintage of their mummy, asserting it originated from an ancient pharaoh or priest. The practice escalated to such an extent that by the mid-700s, certain European physicians were recommending specific cuts of mummy for various ailments. They claimed that the head was most effective for headaches, the heart for cardiac issues, and the feet for foot problems. Wealthy patients could even place special orders for these particular parts, while common people had to rely on generic mummy powder. And if you are curious whether anyone at that time considered this practice to be somewhat disturbing, there were indeed a few rational voices. One such voice was the Arabic physician Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi, who visited Egypt in the 12th century and was appalled to discover that Europeans were consuming mummies. He remarked that this was a barbaric practice unworthy of civilized society. Talk about being ahead of one's time. So what ultimately led Europeans to cease the consumption of mummies? It was not an instantaneous epiphany, but rather a gradual realization that perhaps, just perhaps, consuming ancient human remains was not the most advisable medical practice. The entire trade was so lucrative that by the 1600s, Egypt was nearly depleting its supply of mummies. We are talking about thousands of ancient bodies being excavated and shipped off to be consumed by Europeans. It raises the question of how many invaluable archaeological artifacts ended up in someone's medicine cabinet. Just when you thought this narrative couldn't become any more bizarre, enter the mummy banquets. Yes, you heard correctly. Actual dinner parties where the main event was the consumption of mummies. This is not something you learn in history classes. Imagine this. It is the 1680s in France. You find yourself at a high society gathering. The host is flaunting their wealth and sophistication by serving mummy meat. Guests are sharing plates of flesh that has been meticulously extracted from Egyptian remains, seasoned, and prepared as if it were some kind of ancient delicacy. They are consuming it alongside wine blended with mummy powder, while snacking on bread made with ground mummy, and even sweetening their beverages with mummy-infused sugar. It resembled a macabre farm-to-table movement, except the farm was a tomb, and the table was adorned with thousand-year-old human remains. However, the aristocracy did not limit themselves to merely consuming mummies. They became inventive. Some would host mummy painting gatherings where artists utilized the notorious mummy brown pigment to create portraits of the attendees. These merchants were not particularly careful with their cargo either. They often dismembered mummies into smaller fragments to maximize the number that could fit into their shipping crates. It was akin to a disturbing version of ancient Egyptian Tetris. However, the situation took a darker turn as demand continued to rise, and suppliers struggled to unearth mummies quickly enough. In response, some became inventive. They began creating new mummies from recently deceased individuals, sourcing corpses from hospitals or execution sites, treating them with bouillon and spices, wrapping them up, and voila, authentic Egyptian mummies ready for sale. This is not information typically covered in history classes. The mummy market catered to a wide range of customers. Affluent individuals could purchase entire mummies for display in their homes, while middle-class buyers might acquire smaller fragments or powders from local pharmacies. Some merchants even established mummy grinding operations. Stations located directly within their shops allow you to select your mummy, watch it being ground, and take it home fresh. Just like any luxury market, there were various grades of product available. Top-shelf mummies were claimed to originate from ancient Egyptian royalty. Spoiler alert, they typically were not. Mid-range options might be categorized as priest class or noble mummies. Budget-conscious consumers could purchase common mummy powder, which, to be frank, was likely just ordinary corpse dust mixed with some exotic spices. This is not something you typically learn in history classes. Are you curious about what ailments they believed mummies could heal? Almost everything: headaches, bruises, broken bones, nausea, epilepsy, plague, internal bleeding, you name it. They had a mummy remedy for it. They would incorporate mummy powder into tinctures, form it into pills, dissolve it in liquids, and even create plasters for wounds. Some physicians would even prescribe mummy wine. Yes, you read that correctly. Wine infused with dissolved mummy fragments. The truly astonishing aspect is that this was not merely a fleeting trend. This practice persisted for centuries. Medical texts from the 12th to the 18th century frequently featured mummy preparations in their recommendations. They were so prevalent that one could enter nearly any European pharmacy and request prepared mummy, just as one would ask for aspirin today. But here's the twist. Remember how this all began with a confusion regarding bouillon? The ancient Egyptians did not even utilize bitumen in their mummification methods. They employed natron salt and plant resins instead. Thus, Europeans spent centuries consuming mummies due to a misunderstanding of an Arabic term. Talk about a significant lost in translation incident. As the demand for mummy medicine surged throughout Europe, it established one of history's most peculiar supply chains. Egyptian tombs transformed into new gold mines. Teams grave robbers would raid burial sites, sometimes extracting dozens of mummies in a single night. They would sell these mummies to merchants who packed them onto ships destined for European ports, treating them like cattle. And intriguingly, potential remedies. The trade routes linking Egypt and Europe had evolved beyond the mere transport of spices and silk. They now included the shipment of entire preserved human bodies across the Mediterranean. Mummies became such sought-after items that merchants showcased them in their shop windows alongside luxury goods. Picture strolling through the streets of London or Paris and encountering an ancient Egyptian corpse displayed next to fine silks and exotic spices. This fascination was not a fleeting trend. European aristocrats would host extravagant unwrapping parties, inviting friends to witness the unveiling of a mummy. This resembles a contemporary unboxing video, albeit with a significantly darker twist. People would congregate, sip wine, and observe as layers of ancient wrappings were meticulously removed to unveil the preserved individual within. Such information is not typically covered in history classes. The most astonishing aspect is that these were not merely collector's items, collecting dust on the shelves of the affluent. Apothecaries would display mummy parts alongside their herbs and medicines. Artists utilized a pigment known as mummy brown, which was derived from actual ground mummies. Even Shakespeare referenced mummy as a medicinal substance in his works. This was not an underground black market. It represented mainstream European culture at its peak. However, the narrative takes an even more intriguing turn. These were no longer just exotic curiosities. Europeans had grander ambitions for these ancient remains, and intriguingly, potential remedies. The trade routes linking Egypt and Europe had evolved beyond the mere transport of spices and silk. They now included the shipment of entire preserved human bodies across the Mediterranean. Mummies became such sought-after items that merchants showcased them in their shop windows alongside luxury goods. Picture strolling through the streets of London or Paris and encountering an ancient Egyptian corpse displayed next to fine silks and exotic spices. This fascination was not a fleeting trend. European aristocrats would host extravagant unwrapping parties, inviting friends to witness the unveiling of a mummy. This resembles a contemporary unboxing video, albeit with a significantly darker twist. People would congregate, sip wine, and observe as layers of ancient wrappings were meticulously removed to unveil the preserved individual within. Such information is not typically covered in history classes. The most astonishing aspect is that these were not merely collector's items, collecting dust on the shelves of the affluent. Apothecaries would display mummy parts alongside their herbs and medicines. Artists utilized a pigment known as mummy brown, which was derived from actual ground mummies. Even Shakespeare referenced mummy as a medicinal substance in his works. This was not an underground black market. It represented mainstream European culture at its peak. However, the narrative takes an even more intriguing turn. These were no longer just exotic curiosities. Europeans had grander ambitions for these ancient remains. Imagine this. You find yourself at an extravagant European dinner party in the 1600s. The host presents the main dish with great flair, but instead of a roasted pig or peacock, it is ground human remains, and everyone begins to eat. This is not something you learn in history classes. Yes, you heard correctly. For centuries, Europeans did not merely collect mummies, they consumed them. Real ancient Egyptian mummies, ground up and used as medicine, baked into bread, and even served at lavish banquets. Now you might be wondering, wait a minute, why would anyone do that? Was it some sort of twisted ritual, a peculiar status symbol? Or did they genuinely believe that eating millennia-old corpses would somehow benefit them? Well, stay tuned because this tale becomes even stranger. We are about to explore one of history's most bizarre health fads, one that transformed sacred Egyptian remains into a sought-after commodity throughout Europe. And just wait until you learn about the elite social events where mummy meat took center stage on the menu. Trust me, what these supposedly civilized Europeans did with ancient Egyptian remains will astonish you. Let us rewind to the 1500s in Europe. During the period known as the Renaissance, things were becoming increasingly tumultuous. Explorers returned from far-off lands with tales that seemed almost unbelievable. However, nothing captivated the European imagination quite like ancient Egypt. It was akin to the ultimate display of prestige during the Renaissance. If one aspired to be recognized as important, possessing Egyptian artifacts was essential. Statues, relics, and particularly mummies were not merely regarded as preserved remains. They were symbols of status, conversation starters,